Few peoples throughout history are simultaneously so totally unknown and so maligned as the Philistines. The name alone has become a pejorative byword for an uncultured and uncouth individual. We mostly know of the Philistines from the Bible, where they are the enemies of the people of Israel, a violent lot whose sole aim appears to be subjugating and brutalizing the Israelites. Of course, the Bible is a religious text, and as such can't be expected to report the enemies of the Israelites in an unbiased way. The Philistines are a narrative tool, the archenemy of the book's protagonists. They provide some of the Bible's greatest villains: Delilah, seducer and betrayer of Samson, and Goliath, the arrogant giant slain by the humble David. At the same time, the Philistines leave us very little in the historical record by which we can discern what their culture may have been like. A fact which itself has perhaps accentuated a reliance on biblical sources. We do not know what language the Philistines spoke, what alphabet they used, what their culture held dear. Their gods are unclear, and their origins are an enduring mystery. However, archaeology, in concert with what scant written sources we have, can help us to build a clearer picture of this Levantine people. Their society reflected Aegean, Cypriot, Egyptian, and Canaanite influences. They built great cities with planned layouts. They produced wonderful artistic works, from pottery and textiles to various kinds of metalwork. They were farmers and traders, producing olive oil and wines which they traded and sold throughout the region. Their culture flourished at a time of political upheaval, when the ancient Near East was undergoing a seismic transition from the Age of Bronze to the Age of Iron. Today we will try to discern the answer to this question: who were the Philistines? The origins of the Philistines, like many aspects of their culture, are shrouded in mystery. As they leave no written records of their own, we are reliant on the ever-biased written accounts of other peoples in order to discern an image of the Philistines, as well as what can be implied from archaeological discoveries. When it comes to the Philistines, as mentioned before, the Bible is a rather important source, but one whose historicity will be debated to the end of time, and crucially, one in which the Philistines feature as perhaps the primary enemy of the Israelites. As a result, the Bible doesn't paint a particularly glowing picture of the Philistines. Not only are they violent enemies, but they are also decadent and rich, occupying fertile lands and taking advantage of nearby trade routes. Of course, the word Philistine has come to be a byword for an anti-intellectual brute, a narrow-minded individual hostile to the arts and culture. In any case, what is fascinating is that both written and archaeological sources appear to suggest that the Philistines were not native to the southern Levant, or at least that many elements of their culture were not native to that region. So much so that the scholarly consensus generally agrees that the Philistines were most likely Aegean in their origins. Traditional historical narratives hold that this originally Aegean people came to the southern Levant against the backdrop of the late Bronze Age collapse, a period of social and political upheaval during the 12th century BC, which saw the power of traditional empires in the Near East decline dramatically. The causes for this collapse, whether social, environmental, or by military invasions of a group known as the Sea Peoples, is debated. Clues in biblical accounts of the Philistines appear to point to foreign influences on their culture. The famous combat between the future King David and the giant Philistine Goliath, relayed in the first book of Samuel, contains a telling clue. It has been suggested that the fact that the Philistines send forth Goliath as their champion to engage in single combat is indicative of a practice particular to the Mycenaean kingdoms. This famous tale could therefore hint at an Aegean origin for the Philistines. Beyond the Bible, descriptions of the Philistines are much harder to come by. However, one important source is ancient Egypt. In Egyptian pictorial descriptions of the Sea Peoples, a group of tribes supposed to have attacked Egypt and other areas of the eastern Mediterranean at around the year 1175 BC, there features a group named as the Peliset. These Peliset have, by modern scholarship, come to have been identified as the Philistines. Often shown wearing distinctive hats with a large plume, these Peliset are actually depicted the most out of all the various Sea Peoples in Egyptian sources. as they attacked the Near East in the reign of the pharaoh Ramesses III. Texts accompanying these Egyptian reliefs, found on pylons at Medinet Habu, report that the Sea Peoples, the Peliset amongst them, travelled from Anatolia through the Levant and into Egypt, engaging in battle with the forces of the pharaoh at the Battle of the Delta, a battle which saw the hitherto rampant Sea Peoples defeated and scattered. What became of the Peliset after their defeat is hard to discern. However, further Egyptian sources may provide us with the answer. Inscriptions from Medinet Habu describe the defeated Sea Peoples as being incorporated into the Egyptian Empire, no doubt forced to pay homage and tribute to the pharaohs. Note that the term 9 bows is one used in Egyptian sources to refer to foreign enemies. As for the 9 bows, I have taken away their land and their boundaries. They are added to mine. Their chiefs and their people come to me with praise. It may well be the case that the defeated Peliset were resettled to the north of Egyptian territory, in the southern Levant, over which the Egyptian pharaohs exercised political hegemony. Certainly the cities which we designate as Philistine were almost all originally Canaanite in their foundation. Although traditionally assumed to have been violent, the archaeological record of the cities, which would go on to form the basis of Philistia, the area in which the Philistines lived, display no signs of widespread destruction during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, and no texts relating to the Sea Peoples report an invasion of Canaan itself. Instead, it would seem that the introduction of Philistine pottery in the region, which is usually utilised as a measure of the spread of Philistine culture, was a peaceful affair, suggesting that the Philistines did not violently conquer the southern Levant. Furthermore, Philistine archaeological finds appear to point to a foreign origin, specifically an Aegean one. Pottery in particular led this charge. Early Philistine pottery bears striking resemblances to contemporary Mycenaean pieces in terms of design, with geometric, linear and floral motifs, and first appears in the southern Levant at the very start of the Iron Age. Philistine architecture appears to feature notable departures from local vernacular. Technology utilised by the Philistines appears to be quite different to that used in the southern Levant. Kilns display notable Aegean designs, architectural layouts and features, like bathtubs, column bases, and hearths, are all a departure from the styles of the region. What is also intriguing is that these Aegean technologies and influences did not wholly replace the native Canaanite ones. Rather, the two appear to exist side by side in Philistine cities. For example, after the supposed conquest of Philistia, Canaanite cooking wares can be found throughout Philistine territory. This implies two things: that the Philistines were unlikely to have expelled the native Canaanites from their newly conquered lands, and that Philistine culture developed as a kind of hybrid, incorporating elements of Aegean, Canaanite, and even Egyptian culture. That said, despite these apparent non-local origins, we must be wary of regarding the Philistines as some monolithic group which migrated wholesale into the southern Levant in the late Bronze Age. Increasingly, it is thought that the Philistines may perhaps have been made up of a number of peoples who migrated to the region, bringing with them different cultures and technologies, and who underwent an ethnogenesis in the area to form the culture which we now know as the Philistines. Accordingly, the appearance of the Philistine culture is not the result of a monolithic migration event from Mycenaean Greece, as presented in the past. Rather, this culture coalesced from various peoples, with different geographical, cultural, and socio-political backgrounds, who settled in Philistia at the end of the late Bronze and early Iron Age, merging multiple non-local and local social, political, and cultural elements. These groups underwent a process of ethnogenesis, forming an entangled entity that came to be known as the Philistine culture. In a similar vein, what is also fascinating is the way in which recent research appears to suggest that the labels previously thought to be solid markers of ethnicity or nationality, such as Israelite and Philistine, are in fact not such clear indicators. Rather, it has been suggested that geography and socio-economics are far more reliable markers of how people in the southern Levant lived. For example, that the coastal cities on the Mediterranean and in the valleys of the Shephelah, where the Philistines dwelt, tended to be richer and surrounded by fertile ground than settlements in the hills of Judea, where the Israelites lived. It naturally follows that the inhabitants therefore lived in very different styles, necessitated by economic reality. Riemann believes that we should understand the relationships between the Israelites and Philistines not as an ethnic or cultural antagonism, but as a coastal versus hill country one. It may well be that the ethnic differences between Israelite and Philistine was not so great as the Bible would wish to portray. The Philistine territory, known as Philistia, was made up of 5 cities, themselves known as the Philistine Pentapolis. These cities were contained in the region known as Palestine. In fact, the word Philistine comes to English via Latin and Greek from the Hebrew Philishtim. They are referred to as the people of the Pelesheth, Philistia, and it is from this origin that the Latin name from the region, Palestina, developed. Ekron was the northernmost city, and the only city which was a new Philistine foundation, for the rest of the Philistine cities were originally Canaanite foundations. To the south of Ekron was Gath, whose exact location is still a matter of some debate. Some scholars have suggested that it was located at the site known as Tel Es-Safi. To the west was Ashdod, a major city mentioned in the Bible as the center of Philistine religion. Texts found in the ancient city of Ugarit attest to the importance of Ashdod before the arrival of the Philistines at the end of the Bronze Age. Ashkelon, located on the shores of the Mediterranean, was the only one of the major Philistine cities with a sizable port, indicating that it was likely the city with the greatest trade activity. The southernmost city, Gaza, was originally an Egyptian settlement before the arrival of the Philistines. It is thought to have been the location of the biblical narrative of Samson and Delilah. Interestingly, many of the major Philistine cities were situated in a region known as the Shephelah, a hilly area made up of wide, accessible, and extremely fertile valleys. Control of these valleys was crucial for the Philistine economy, which was largely based on agriculture. Such land was perfect for the cultivation of crops, olive oil production, wine production, and the rearing of livestock. Aside from these cities, a number of smaller settlements existed throughout Philistine territory. However, the vast majority of what we know about Philistine culture and the apparent political and religious focus of their society was these 5 cities. According to the Hebrew Bible, the extent of Philistine territory stretched from Wadi Gaza in the south to the banks of the Yarkon River in the north. The eastern border of Philistia was less well-defined and likely subject to ebbs and flows as the power of the Philistines waxed and waned. After establishing their initial political dominance over the 5 cities of the so-called Pentapolis in the early 12th century BC, the Philistines may have embarked upon military campaigns, which expanded and cemented their control over the southern Levant. Traditionally, historians believed that this was a period of aggressive expansion, thought to have taken place over the course of roughly a century until the mid-11th century BC, when the Philistines came into conflict with the Israelites. During this period, cities in the Jezreel Valley, such as Megiddo and Afula, may have come under Philistine hegemony, as indicated by the discovery of a good deal of Philistine goods, in particular pottery from this time period. Many cities across this region have also yielded examples of Philistine pottery. In the case of Megiddo, these pottery pieces are accompanied by evidence of physical destruction, perhaps suggesting that the inhabitants of the city resisted Philistine aggression. The opposite appears to be the case for Afula, as very little evidence of violence has been found, suggesting that a peace was negotiated with the conquerors, or else that the city submitted. However, many scholars believe that the presence of Philistine pottery in this region may not indicate political hegemony at all, but rather trade. This is particularly reinforced by the fact that Philistine pottery in the area appears in very small numbers. If the Philistines did in fact establish political control over the Jezreel Valley, it cannot have been more than a relatively light administration by elites. Scholars increasingly believe that the idea that the Philistines violently invaded the southern Levant is an inaccurate one. Certainly, it is not really supported by the archaeological record. Instead, it may well be that the flourishing of Philistine power and culture at the very end of the Bronze Age and beginning of the Iron Age was more down to the decline in Egyptian power in the region during the late Bronze Age collapse. With the need to pay large tributes to their Egyptian overlords removed, the cities of Philistia increased in population and urban area, becoming increasingly successful economic centres. The Bible describes a series of protracted conflicts between the Israelites and the Philistines. Naturally, we must be wary of the historicity of the Bible concerning the Philistines, as it is, after all, a religious text primarily concerned with depicting the Israelites as God's chosen people. But it does give us an intriguing narrative concerning Philistine-Israelite relations. It should also be noted that the sharp social and ethnic distinctions drawn between these two peoples by the Bible are thought by some scholars to be vastly exaggerated. It has been argued instead that economics were far more important in defining the way these groups lived, with the Israelites dwelling in the less fertile and poorer hill regions, while the Shephelah and the coastal regions were occupied by the Philistines. These theological and ethnic demarcations, made in order to stabilize Judean identity, do not reflect historical reality. Generally, the Bible, and in particular the book of Judges, the book of Samuel, and the books of Chronicles, describe the Israelites as being politically dominated by the Philistines. The period of the Judges, when the Israelites were organized around a loose confederation of tribes, is thought to have lasted from the mid-12th to the late 11th century BC. The Bible describes this period as being punctuated by episodes of conflict between the dominant Philistines and the politically inferior Israelites, a power dynamic which was supposedly ended by the formation of the unified Kingdom of Israel. Perhaps the most famous example of Israelite-Philistine antagonism is the story of Samson, one of the judges of the Israelites, gifted with immense strength by God, strength that he used to massacre an entire army of Philistines with no more than a donkey's jawbone for a weapon in chapter 15 of the book of Judges. Samson is betrayed by his lover Delilah, who cuts his hair, depriving him of his strength. Delilah herself is bribed to do so by the lords of the Philistines, who then capture Samson, taking him to Gaza City and forcing the once great Israelite to mill grain. Samson's famous demise, where the miraculous restoration of his strength via prayer allows him to destroy the Philistine temple where he is being held by collapsing the pillars, takes place in the temple of Dagon, a Philistine deity who may have been worshipped as the father of the gods. Indicative of the subjugation of the Israelites was a ban on weaponry, which the Philistines supposedly imposed upon their subjects, illustrated by a segment in the first book of Samuel. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "The Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves." So all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles. However, this prohibition apparently did not prevent the Israelites from rising in open rebellion against Philistine rule, led by Saul. A series of battles were reported in the Bible. At the Battle of Michmash, the Philistines were reportedly routed by an Israelite force led by Jonathan, son of King Saul, whilst an engagement in the valley of Elah was the backdrop for the single combat between the Philistine giant Goliath and the future King David. However, the Philistines appear to have struck a devastating blow with victory at the Battle of Mount Gilboa, in which the Israelites were utterly defeated. Saul's sons, Jonathan, Aminadab, and Malchishua, were all killed, and Saul himself fell on his sword rather than face captivity. Being the sworn enemies of the Bible's protagonists, the Philistines are shown to be savage and cruel with the bodies of their enemies. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armour, and sent into the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols and amongst the people. And they put his armour in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. However, it would be King David who eventually defeated and subjugated the Philistines at the head of the United Kingdom of Israel, which perhaps occurred at the very end of the 11th century, or very early in the 10th century BC. Although David routed Philistine forces and apparently even captured Gath, Philistia itself does not appear to have been occupied by the Israelites. During this period, the Philistine cities were rather at the mercy of larger foreign powers that surrounded them, in particular Egypt. According to the first book of Kings, an unnamed Egyptian pharaoh, the father-in-law of King Solomon, captured and razed the city of Giza before gifting it to his daughter, and both biblical and Egyptian sources attest to the fact that the pharaoh Shoshenq's campaign against the Israelites used the city of Gaza as a staging post. It was only with the breakup of the United Monarchy into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in around the year 930 BC that the Philistines were apparently able to re-establish their political presence in the region. It seems that the Philistines were able to maintain a degree of political independence until the mid-8th century BC. As with other Levantine peoples, such as the Phoenicians, they may have been nominally under Egyptian hegemony and made to pay tributes. However, Egyptian political supremacy in the region in this period is often noted for its relatively light touch. The cities of the Phoenicians, for example, enjoyed a high degree of political and economic autonomy, while still nominally being under Egyptian control. It was a threat from further east, whose violent efforts to exert hegemony over the southern Levant, which spelt the beginning of the end for the Philistines, in the form of the conquering Neo-Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III. We will return to this later. For now, let us consider the society and culture of the Philistines. Politically, Philistia was dominated by the 5 main Philistine cities. Although referred to collectively as the Philistine polity, these cities were not united in a single empire or state. Rather, they were independent entities that often acted in confederacy. This cooperation between the Philistine cities appears to have, at times, taken the form of councils convened in order to discuss important matters. The Bible relates the Philistine council that was gathered in order to decide what was to be done with the Ark of the Covenant, taken from the Israelites in battle near Aphek. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines, and said, "What shall we do with the Ark of the God of Israel?" They answered, "Let the Ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath." So they brought the Ark of the God of Israel there. The rulers or kings of Philistine cities were known as Seren, or plural, Serenim. Whether these rulers reigned as hereditary monarchs or autarchs who exercised power after establishing their position through political intrigue is not clear. Only one of these Serenim is identified by name in the Bible, the ruler of Gath, whose name is given as Achish. Archaeology also points to the existence of an elite class amongst the Philistines, one with the ability to procure elite goods. Horses and chariots were evidently prized amongst the elite, as testified by the discovery of chariot linchpins and horse bones at Ekron and Ashkelon. Culturally, the Philistine elite display a mixture of styles. Although 4 of the 5 Philistine cities were originally founded by Canaanites, elite archaeological finds in these cities display Canaanite, Aegean, and Egyptian influences. For example, a palace in Ashdod which was remodeled with features reminiscent of the contemporary Aegean elite. Of particular interest to us is the question of what Philistine culture looked like. We know that the Philistines incorporated elements of Aegean, Egyptian, and local Canaanite cultures, leading to an eventual merging which created Philistine culture. However, what we do not clearly understand is how this looked socially. There is no evidence that would indicate that the local Canaanites formed an underclass who served the Philistine rulers as an agricultural workforce. However, an elite class clearly did exist to some extent. Whether this was a Philistine ethnic elite who ruled the region in a similar style to the Egyptians, or a hybrid elite comprised of Canaanites and Philistines, we cannot say with any certainty. The discovery of the archaeological remains of agriculture, as we shall see in the next section of this video, point to the fact that the Philistines were accomplished farmers. However, it appears from the very earliest levels excavated in Philistine cities that this was a people who were primarily urban dwellers. The best preserved examples of this are perhaps in Ashdod, where the city was divided into clear zones: an industrial area, a central region with monumental architecture and religious shrines, and residential areas. Ashdod and other Philistine cities were customarily surrounded by mud brick fortifications. Agriculture apparently formed the primary part of the economy of the Philistine polities. The location of major Philistine cities would point to this, as 4 of the 5 are located inland and are all surrounded by some of the finest arable land in the region, in the wide fertile valleys known as the Shephelah. These valleys not only presented excellent agricultural opportunities, but also facilitated trade between the Philistine cities and beyond, and easy travel links between the inland cities and the coastal plains and ports, where north-south trade traditionally flowed. Philistine settlement patterns were apparently so centered around agricultural concerns that defense was somewhat neglected. None of the cities of the Phoenician Pentapolis are located on easily defensible hills or bluffs. as was usual for the time period. The Philistines also introduced some non-local species to the southern Levant, notably coriander, popular not only as a spice but also as an offering. Bay leaves too would seem to have been introduced by the Philistines, providing them not only with wood for the purposes of construction and manufacturing, but also with fruit, a small shiny black berry which contains oils. It was not simply plants that Philistines introduced to the region either. Pigs, perhaps brought from the Aegean or from Anatolia, were kept for their meat. Interestingly, evidence of pig rearing can only be found in regions of Philistia blessed with a relatively temperate climate and readily accessible sources of water, such as the Shephelah. The southern Negev, on the other hand, has produced almost no porcine evidence. In the Iron Age, Philistine animal husbandry moved away from pigs and increasingly into cattle, who were used both for meat and milk and as plough animals. This increased emphasis on beasts of burden, combined with the fact that many Philistine sites are located in fertile alluvial valleys, has led to the hypothesis that in the Iron Age the Philistines underwent something of an agricultural revolution. As was common in the Levant at the time, olive oil was a major agricultural product. Large circular stone presses extracted the valuable liquid, with freestanding presses, complete with press weights, being developed in the later Iron Age. Wine too was a major product of Philistia, being a good climate for grapevines, and both wine and olive oil were exported around the Philistine cities and beyond, in particular to Egypt. The Philistines certainly did produce a number of textile products. A number of pinched loom weights discovered at archaeological sites point to this. Intriguingly, their style is more similar to Aegean weaving practices. However, these weights could have developed in the Levant. It also appears that mercantilism formed no small part of the Philistine economy. Before we begin to conjure up images of coastal merchants with vast trading networks in the style of the Phoenicians, it should be noted that the archaeological record seems to suggest that Philistine trading activity was pretty much entirely localized. Professor of Mediterranean archaeology Asaf Yassor Landau suggested that the archaeological record points to the lack of long-distance commercial activity by the Philistines. Furthermore, the rulers of the Philistine cities, the Seranim, appear not to have participated heavily in trading activity, if at all. Excavations of cities in Philistia found no large-scale storage rooms for goods or accumulations of luxury goods, which would be indicative of trade. Amongst the best-known elements of Philistine culture are ceramics. Philistine pottery features distinct shapes and designs not found in contemporary southern Levantine pottery traditions, which points to foreign influences. The earliest Philistine pottery is monochrome, before the classic red and black style associated with Philistia developed. Mycenaean motifs are most dominant, with most common ones including birds, fish, spirals, semicircles and chevrons, all adorning bowls, craters, syrup jars, pyxis and three-handled jars. Early Philistine kilns too point to outside influences. The technologically advanced kiln found at Tel Jemeh is rather similar to other sophisticated Bronze Age kilns found on Crete and at Miletus in Anatolia. That said, the Philistines did utilize local Levantine techniques too, as many Iron Age kilns are comparable to examples found in Syria and the Levant. Quite important to note is that the appearance of outside technologies does not necessarily mean that the Philistines were using these technologies in a way that the Aegeans were using them. They were likely adapted to their local context and found new meanings in this way. Essentially, this led to what might be considered a distinctly Philistine style, a hybrid Aegean style produced in the southern Levant. Despite their warlike image, notably propagated by the Bible, Philistine archaeological sites generally do not yield greater numbers of weaponry than other non-Philistine sites in the region. That said, a large number of metallurgical finds at Tel Es-Safi, thought to be the site of Gath, appear to be very different from local metalwork, once more pointing to outside influences. Furthermore, Philistine architectural styles in the Levant seem to point to a potential non-local origin, including temple and house layouts, bathtubs, column bases, hearths, platforms and benches. A megalithic hammer-dressed wall, constructed in the casemate style, could even point to a Western origin, as the casemate method is more readily associated with Hittite and Aegean construction. Casemate is a double wall construction where lateral walls are erected between the two main walls, creating a series of rooms which can be used for residential or storage purposes. Pebble hearths, very different to the local mud-constructed ovens which can be found across the region, have been discovered in many Philistine sites. Traditional wisdom held that the Philistines spoke an Aegean or Cypriot language and used one of the accompanying writing systems from those regions. However, this is no longer certain. In fact, it seems likely that the Philistines spoke a variety of languages, reflecting their mixed origins. The nature of the Philistine language and the alphabet that they used is subject to a huge amount of debate and is incredibly unclear. Some clues can be gleaned from the Hebrew Bible. The title of the rulers of the Philistine cities, Seren or Serenim, is thought to be Indo-European in origin. It has even been suggested that it could be related to Proto-Greek or Lydian and the Greek word tyrannos, meaning tyrant. Early Iron Age inscriptions are, as of yet, totally absent, although 2 seals from Ashdod have been discovered bearing undeciphered signs. Furthermore, it has been suggested that clay tablets found at Tel Deir Allah could be a previously undiscovered Philistine script. Interestingly, the Bible does not appear to mention any language problems when it came to communication between Israelites and Philistines, as it does for Assyrians and Babylonians. Most Philistine names are Semitic in their origin, although it is certainly possible that these names and other Semitic elements in the Philistine language were borrowed from the local inhabitants of the southern Levant. However, it is also worth noting that some Philistine names, such as Goliath and Achish, are non-Semitic. Indo-European origins have been suggested, although this is a matter of some debate. Writing technologies employed at Philistine sites are in keeping with local norms. Clay tablets, writing on pots using paint and ink, and carved stone inscriptions. While there is some evidence for the use of Cypro-Minoan signs on some Philistine pots, this is speculative. The primary starting point for any discussion of Philistine religion is customarily the Bible, for it contains the names of many Philistine deities, as well as clues to the Philistine religious practices. Like most contemporary Middle Eastern peoples, the Philistines' religion was based around cult worship of a pantheon of gods. The first book of Samuel relays a narrative concerning how the Philistines, having defeated the Israelites at the Battle of Aphek, captured the Ark of the Covenant and stored it in the Temple of Dagon in the city of Ashdod. When the Philistines took the Ark of God, they brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. And when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. The significance of this passage is that it reveals how the Philistines' cult worship revolved around temples, which contained cult statues. This is what is referred to in the line, "and set it by Dagon." Like many ancient Near Eastern peoples, such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, the Philistines likely considered their cult statues to be the earthly vessels of their deities. As such, the presentation of the captured ark was an offering by the Philistines to Dagon. The presentation of the cult statues of vanquished enemies was another common Near Eastern practice. Of course, as the Israelites forbade idol worship and therefore had no cult statue of their god, the ark was probably considered to be the next best thing. Ancient Near Eastern cult worship went hand in hand with the priestly class, who administered temples and carried out rituals, often including sacrifice to appease the divine. Observance of ritual was crucial for the smooth functioning of society, for the assurance of good harvests and material prosperity. Sacrifice would typically involve the killing of sheep or cattle, the burning of the animal's fat upon the altar of the deity, and the ritual consumption of its meat by worshippers. Unlike other better-known Near Eastern peoples, such as the Mesopotamians or Egyptians, who often produced inscribed documentation of their ritual practices, the Philistines have not left us any written records of their rituals. Cult-related artifacts discovered from Philistine sites display broad similarities with contemporary pieces that can be found across the southern Levant, such as altars and incense holders. although a few objects, such as the two-horned altar from Tel Es-Safi, thought to be Gath, appear to show hybrid influences, in this case local and Western. Figurines depicting a seated female figure, likely a goddess, are a common artifact found in Philistia and are known as Ashdoda. The forms of these votive statues is consistent with Aegean worship. Mourning customs too can be guessed at from the discovery of further terracotta mourning figures at burial sites in Azor and Tel Jemmeh. Female in form and depicted with hands placed on the head or across the breast, these figurines are quite similar to examples found in the Aegean, on the Greek mainland, Rhodes, Naxos, and eastern Crete. The presence of these classic cult artifacts in Philistia indicates that the Philistines worshipped their deities in a very similar fashion to other ancient Near Eastern peoples. If the cult was the primary method of Philistine worship, the great focus of Philistine religion was of course the gods and goddesses themselves. The passage we looked at earlier from the first book of Samuel not only indicates Philistine religious customs, but names their chief god, Dagon. Dagon's importance to the Philistines is demonstrable in this passage, as his temple is where they bring the most precious religious relic of the defeated Israelites. It is important to note that there is precious little extra-biblical evidence to support the idea that Dagon was considered by the Philistines to be their most important deity. While it is possible that Dagon, who seems to have been considered to be a creator god or father of the gods, originated as an Aegean or Indo-European god whom the Philistines brought to the southern Levant, it may also be the case that he was an existing Canaanite god, perhaps based on the god of grain and prosperity, Dagon, who was worshipped in Syria before the Philistines migrated. The Ashdoda statues, mentioned earlier, are thought to bear many similarities with figurines of seated women found in the Aegean, many of which are depicted holding children. It is therefore possible, and has been hypothesized, that these Ashdoda represent some form of maternal goddess, which the Philistines may have brought with them to the southern Levant. The dating of these figurines certainly appears to coincide with Philistine political prominence, with the majority of these discovered in the city of Ekron and Ashdod dating from the 12th and 11th centuries BC, and appearing as late as the 8th century BC. Along with their Aegean or hybrid gods, the Philistines certainly adopted a number of Canaanite deities. One such deity was Astarte, a Canaanite war goddess whose popularity was pretty much ubiquitous amongst Canaanite peoples. If the Philistines did indeed come to the Levant a part of the military campaigns of the Sea Peoples, the worship of a war goddess would certainly make sense. According to the first book of Samuel, the Philistines took the body of the defeated and slain Saul to the temple of Astarte, referred to as Ashtaroth. Another god adopted from the Philistines was Baal, chief deity amongst the Canaanite peoples, and a god associated with rain. In the second book of Kings, King of Israel Isaiah I, struck down by illness, sends messengers to the city of Ekron to seek the protection of the god Baal-zebub. It seems likely that in this case, Baal-zebub is a localized variant of the Canaanite Baal, adopted by the Philistines and adapted to his local context. The mid-8th century BC brought with it a severe decline in the fortunes of the Philistine cities. The Neo-Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III, crowned in 745 BC and intent upon reversing the stagnation which gripped his empire, set out on a series of military campaigns which nearly doubled the lands under his command. Centralizing power into the hands of the monarchy and professionalizing the Assyrian army, Tiglath-Pileser embarked upon a series of conquests in the Levant from 743 to 732 BC. Over a decade of violence, the Assyrians captured and subjugated the entire region, establishing political hegemony, including over the cities of the Philistines. Gaza itself was one of the final strongholds to fall 734 AD, and resulted in Egypt and Assyria sharing a border for the first time. The antagonism between Assyria and Egypt would have a powerful effect upon the Philistines, as Egyptian pharaohs began to bribe the subject peoples of the Assyrians into rebelling against their overlords. Around the year 711, the city of Ashdod withheld tribute and rose up in rebellion. The Assyrian king, Sargon II, reacted with a full military invasion, capturing and sacking Ashdod and Gath. Philistia was then incorporated as a full Assyrian province. Their cities I built anew, and settled therein the people of the lands my hands had conquered. My official I set over them as governor. I counted them with the people of Assyria, and drew my yoke. This defeat was a hammer blow for the Philistines. Standard practice amongst the Assyrians was to sack or destroy rebellious cities, carry off cult statues to the capital of Nineveh, and resettle the rebellious peoples throughout the Assyrian Empire. The text we just saw hints at this. It is likely that at least some inhabitants of Ashdod and Gath were resettled elsewhere, and that the rebuilt cities were partially populated with non-Philistines. Gath itself appears to have been totally destroyed, as it is not mentioned again in later sources detailing the Philistines. In 705 BC, King of Judah Hezekiah raised the flag of rebellion against Assyria. The Philistine cities appear to have been divided during this rebellion. The king of Ashkelon joined the rebels, whilst Ekron's ruler remained loyal, and as a result, his city was besieged and captured by the rebels. Roused to action, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded the region to once again establish control, capturing Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron, and exacting heavy tribute from their inhabitants. The fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 612 BC offered no respite to the Philistines, as the Neo-Babylonian Empire quickly rose to take its place in exerting control over Philistia. It was during the reign of the proactive Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II that the Philistines met their eventual demise. The newly crowned king sought to establish his control over the Levant early in his reign. In fact, it was in the first year of his rule that he marched on Ashkelon, which had rebelled against him. The Neo-Babylonian annals describe how the king of Ashkelon was taken captive following the fall of his city, and how Ashkelon itself was first sacked and then razed to the ground. This brutal levelling of the rebel city is reinforced by recent archaeological discoveries, which found wholesale destruction consistent with a violent sack. In the years that followed, Gaza and Ekron were certainly captured, and likely suffered a similar fate. It was not simply the Philistines who were brought under the Babylonian yoke. The entirety of the Levant was subjugated by Nebuchadnezzar and integrated into the burgeoning Neo-Babylonian Empire. Large numbers of Philistines were resettled in Babylon, and those who remained in the Levant succumbed to the slow process of acculturation, their cultural identity having been seriously weakened by the destruction of their cities and the deportations of their people. The remnants of the Philistines, sundered from their cultural roots, actually appear to have been fully assimilated with neighbouring peoples in the region. In the words of Gittin, Philistia no longer had a sufficiently strong or resilient core culture to survive the destruction of its cities and the deportation of its population. Like the Assyrians before them, the Babylonians engaged in the settlement and exile of conquered or rebellious peoples, as a measure to prevent further insurrection. Famously, a large number of Judeans from the Kingdom of Judah were exiled to Babylon after the siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC. Similarly, it seems that a large number of Philistines were exiled to Babylon too. These exiles were able to maintain their sense of Philistine identity for a time, referring to themselves as men of Gaza or Ashkelon for at least a century and a half after they left the southern Levant. These mentions of the Philistines, exiled thousands of miles from home, represent their last appearance in the written record. Long deprived of their political independence, the Philistine culture gradually faded, no doubt accelerated by the repeated conquests and the resettlements at the hands of the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian kings. By the Persian period, beginning in the mid-5th century BC, inhabitants of the region of Philistia were known rather as Phoenicians. The Philistines, erstwhile antagonists of the Bible, were no more. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.